Hello, this will be the makeup lecture for the class we were missing on Monday, March 5th. Now, we'll be exploring in this chapter, the main theme is that of reordering the world. We're going to see a lot of transformation in this chapter, in a sense, in a shorter period of time than we saw in the other chapters, right? In the other chapters, we were basically covering the years from the 1500s to till the 1700s. And there was change, certainly, but in this period, the change is, in a sense, for many people, is going to be speeding up, and it's going to be more radical. Um, and much of this change is being driven by the search for freedom, particularly economic and political freedom. And it's key to note that these two things are often intertwined. Rising economic power of a class will encourage that class to seek more political freedom for itself, and political freedom can often also encourage economic growth as well. So it's going to be kind of complex. But there is, to divide the two, it's going to be difficult just to say, well, this is just economic freedom and political freedom. They're intertwined. But the key thing is the search for freedom that includes both of these concepts that react and interact with each other. And a lot of this is going to be a reaction to mercantilism. You'll remember that mercantilism focused on this idea that a mother country should have colonies and should stop other people from trading in its colonies, and should because it needs to hold on to, because there's only a finite amount of wealth. For me to win, you have to lose. For me to get richer, you have to get poorer. And this is oftentimes a reaction to mercantilism that says, no, actually, if we all trade together, we can all profit more. So it's a demand for more freedom to trade, and a demand for more sharing in government power that we're going to be seeing throughout this chapter. In this lecture, we're going to be focusing on the political aspect of things. We're going to be focusing on this idea of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the idea that the right to rule, the legitimacy of the government, flows from the people. It doesn't flow from a king selected by God, it flows from the people, and they're the ones that, in a sense, are the center of rule, and and your legitimacy has to come from them. Without their approval, you can be overthrown. So unlike Louis XIV, as absolutist king, you are not responsible to God Almighty alone, you are responsible in a sense to the people Almighty. And connected with this is the idea of nationalism, this idea that each nation should have its own state. So the Chinese should have a Chinese state, Canadians should have a Canadian state, Greeks should have a Greek state, where Greece is part of the Ottoman Empire at this time. But they will use this idea of nationalism, that each nation should have its own state, to try and break away from the Ottoman Empire, right? And the key thing about nationalism we need to know is that there's this shift in nationalism from the subject to the citizen, right? When you're a subject of a king, of a monarch, you're basically just supposed to pay your taxes and be good. You're not supposed to really contribute all that positively to the state. Other than that, you're just supposed to pay your taxes and not rebel. And your relationship with the state in many ways isn't that close. In nationalism, when you have a nation state, you typically become a citizen. And your fate is said to be very closely tied to the fate of your state. And you are expected to fight and die for that state. You're expected to sacrifice your own interest to benefit the state, because in the end, the state's interest and your interest are the same. And what this will allow states to do is to really harness the power of their people, and it gives them a lot of strength. So, for example, as we'll see with during the French Revolution, the this idea where French people change from being subjects to citizens will allow for the French army to go up to be 800,000 men strong. And this is very different from just a few centuries ago. During the 30 Years' War, you had armies usually about 20 or 30,000 strong. So not that many people, and they were typically all mercenaries. They were people who were being paid to fight. But when you shift this idea of nationalism, where each individual person is no longer a subject, but a citizen who's expected to be whose fate is closely bound to the state, and who has a lot of duties, but also is given, in a sense, more rights to interact with the state, then you can raise these gigantic armies, and you can mobilize the resources in your territory much more effectively, and that actually allows you to extend your empire as well, which France France is going to attempt to do during the Napoleonic, during the Revolution, during the Napoleonic period, and England will successfully do. And I want to come back to this term. We talked about it near the beginning of class, but I want to just, or the beginning of our class, rather, the whole entire class, this idea of the imagined community, right? We often feel our first loyalty is to our families, right? They're the ones we first know, or to the local community, right? Because those are people you see face to face. When you switch to this idea of a national, or to this idea of nationalism, you develop what's called an imagined community. You may have never been to these different regions of your country, but you have this idea that they are also all equally French or German or Spanish or what have you, right? This idea, and what's key about nationalism is that in nationalism the state comes first, comes before family, becomes before the local, and all that, and all that. And this feeling is established by building this imagined community, convincing you that these people you had never seen before, who speak a language the same or similar to yours and have similar customs and are ruled by the same state, to convince them that they are more important in a sense than your family is kind of a difficult thing to do, but it can be done. And one of the key things that's going to be done through is through the state, through conscription into armies, which bring people from all different areas together, through an educational system that teaches you that you're all members of the same state and teaches you how to speak the proper English or proper French or what have you, as well as through newspapers, where even if you live far away, they'll report news of the capital, making you think that you are a part of the country. And so you had this establishment of building an imagined community of nationalistic citizens who are all members of the same nation state, and this allows for the growth of the power, right? But it also allows for growth and power in two ways. The nation state becomes much more powerful than the old traditional empires, right? And this will often become a way of justifying getting rid of them. But it also, for states or for nations within the empires to break away, such as Greece attempting to break away from Turkey, as I said. But also what it allows is, because you're now a citizen, you have more rights and more privileges, right? The state has to give you something in order to take your resource to make you more willing, and these things include economic and political freedom, right? So this is all connected. Now there are going to be some problems people have to deal with, though, as you have these growing demands for freedom. One thing, how far should these freedoms extend? Should the right to vote just be extended only to men? Should it be extended only to white men? Should it be only extended to white men who hold property, right? Or should it be extended to women and people of African descent, right? Who gets these rights? And there's conflicts over which freedom should take precedent. Does the slave owner's right to individual property take precedent over the slave's right to freedom, right? There's going to be lots of disputes about these things. Now, the first place that these ideas, in a sense, are going to really take hold, where they're able to affect major political and economic change, is in the American Revolution, which your book refers to as the North American War of Independence. I'll just say American Revolution because I imagine that's the term that you're used to from your grade school, middle school, and high school educations. In the American Revolution, you have some economic issues going on. You have the growth of power of middle and upper class of property holders, right? And for them, there is basically a connection of political and economic interests in the colony, right? And we have to stress this, is that these reforms, this ordering, you can't separate, or it's difficult. You can classify something as political or economic, but in practice they're oftentimes very, very closely intertwined. And it's important to remember, much of our revolution started because of this intertwining between political and economic interests. And what is key to note is these interests began to diverge from those of Great Britain, which is what essentially led for the colonies to break away from Great Britain. Now, what was the causes of this division? Well, we talked about in previous class about the 7 Years' War, which is also referred to as the French Indian Wars. And this was, as we talked about, this is a mercantilist war that goes throughout much of the world. Right, we talked about, it doesn't only just happen in the United States, for example, it also happens in India with the Battle of Plassey. And the French were defeated soundly by the British and forced to give up their territory in Canada, right? And that's why in Canada you have, in the eastern part, you have large numbers of French-speaking people. that's where this comes from, because it was originally a French colony. And the colonists, it would seem, really profit from it, right? They're now safe. The French were their major security fear, right? So the colonists are of course happy about how this war has gone. They're now safe from the French menace. But one thing they were also hoping to get from this was land. They were hoping that that this would allow them to expand into French territories, because remember the French territories ran down past, right alongside parallel, the American colonies. But in 1763, the British issued a royal proclamation that said there would be no new settlement beyond a certain line into these areas, and this was very upsetting to the colonists. The British wanted to do this to maintain good relationships with the Indians. They wanted to keep the colonists from coming in and pushing them off their lands. The colonists wanted to be able to do that in a large part because that was a kind of safety valve for the colonial colonies. Basically, you had people come into the colonies, people who were born in the colonies who wanted to become wealthier, who wanted to get money, who wanted to become landowners and property owners themselves. But there was only so much property within the colonies, right? People had been there for over 100 years by now. And so those people wanted to go out and settle and clear lands for farming and so forth that belonged to the Indians. And this was an important safety valve, right? These people could, instead of staying home in the colonies and rioting or trying to lead to class warfare, they could go out and take land there. So this was very serious concern for the colonists. They were not happy that they weren't going to be able to continue expanding land. And Great Britain was also not particularly happy. Great Britain had paid a lot of money to win this war, and they wanted the colonists to help pay for it. Pay for the debts that Great Britain had incurred. Now it's important to note the colonists did spend money raising militias and did fight in the war, but Great Britain had extended a lot of debt for it, and they wanted the colonists to pay. So this is a difficult situation because both sides are having more and more demands of the other, and there's less and less to keep them together, right? The French are gone. The colonists and the British would have to hold together, right, out of fear of the French, but the French are gone now. They don't have to do that. From the king's perspective, he wants the colonists to pay a lot more money and to pay new taxes, and they're going to be passing all these new taxes on the colonists to make them pay what is the British see as their fair side, as part of the debt. The colonists are going to say, we already paid our share. You don't have the right to include these taxes, and we're getting a raw deal out of this because you're not going to let us expand into these lands. And the French aren't here anyway, so what do we need you for, right? So we're going to see increasing division amongst them. And you are going to see a kind of resistance. You're going to see petitions. You're going to see boycotts. You're going to see things like the Boston Tea Party, right? You're going to see these kind of issues. And the colonists are going to be drawing upon ideas like those of John Locke and the social contract. This idea that governments have a contract with their people, and if the government betrays that contract, you can overthrow it, right? And so there's this idea of natural rights as well, too, that there's certain natural rights that human beings have. So, for example, our Declaration of Independence talks about them as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if a government violates these natural rights, you can overthrow it. And I'm just struck, I don't know enough about this time period to say for certain, but of course this is a time period when you're talking about natural laws of science and so forth, as we saw on Friday with the introduction to one of Newton's texts, right? They talk about this idea of natural law, referring to scientific law. And so there's this idea, I think, that these all come together, that in a sense, just as there's natural laws that govern the universe, we human beings have a nature, and because of that, there's a natural way that we ought to be taught, or ought to be treated, and this is a violation of that natural way. And one of these violations, of course, would have been the idea of no taxation without representation, which, of course, was one thing the colonists complained about. How can you tax us without having us have some say in the kind of taxes that we're going to have to pay? Now, and this was the issue, because the taxes themselves, and my understanding, some of the taxes were heavy and difficult. Some of the taxes weren't, but the colonists weren't so interested in that. It was the principle: who has the right to tax? Now, in 1775, the Boston militia clashes, or a Boston militia, I should say, clashes with British soldiers, and in 1776, this escalates, and there is the Declaration of Independence, which draws upon these John Locke's ideas. Now, as the Americans declare independence, they have to kind of organize how they're going to govern themselves, right? In some colonies, for example, they had a royal governor sent from England who was supposed to govern them. Well, they can't have royal governors anymore, obviously, because they're at war with England. So they have a lot of constitutional conventions, which basically transform the colonies into states. They get together and they have a written constitution, which is going to tell them what and how they're going to run their government. And these tend to have a very strong emphasis on the legislature, um, the body that passes laws, right? Um, and drawing on Jock's, this is, I think, in part drawing on John Locke's ideas, where you don't want one branch of government to have too much power, so you have some separation of powers, right? You have an executive, a legislature, and a judicial branch. And a lot of times the colonies tended to prefer to put more power in the legislature rather than the executive branch. I think they were afraid of a powerful executive, right? One person executive branch is usually just one person at the center. That's too much power. Whereas the legislature, there's lots of different people and not so powerful. But one kind of identity crisis that the United States will have is: are we the United States or these United States, right? Are we a singular country, or are we more of a confederation? And it's going to start off more as the United States. It's not going to be several decades later that people start talking more about the United States. But the key thing here, but there's going to be that kind of transformation, a move more towards greater centralization, right? And of course, they had to face the same kind of difficulties. Who should vote, right? And this will continue on with Americans for a long time. And this also points to kind of the paradox in our history, right? Even though Americans were rebelling in the name of political and economic freedom, but for some Americans, this freedom included the idea of freedom of, well, for all the Americans, include the idea of freedom of property. For some of the Americans, it included the idea that this property extended to slavery, right? So I'm rebelling for freedom, for liberty, in part to own slaves freely. Now, the British played upon this, and many African people of African descent would fight for the British in hopes that the British would win and would give them their freedom. But this didn't happen. The British lost. But the point is, this points to this kind of American paradox that we have, right? And this difficulty of freedom. Whose freedom over whom, right? Freedom, even though it sounds very good to us, can often be used because, I mean, hey, we're all for freedom, but in this case, freedom can be used as a pretext to deprive someone else of their freedom. So we have to really think about the content of freedom and not just use it as a word that means something positive. We need to really think seriously about it. Now, the victory, the colonists, of course, win the war, and America gets the United States, what will eventually become the United States, gets its independence. But it's kind of a strange war in that it's really a kind of a marathon. It's whichever side is going to last the longest is going to win. The British win most of the major battles, and they control the cities. And I remember when I was in middle school, I was taught, and I think this is accurate, that one of George Washington's greatest skills was his ability to retreat well. He could be defeated in battle, but his army wouldn't be destroyed. So the rebels were able to keep an army in the field, and they were able to stay a force even though the British kept winning and even though they controlled the cities. And the problem that the rebels had was each time that they actually would win a battle, the British Navy would just swoop in and pick up the British army and put them down someplace else. And so the rebels just couldn't defeat the British in a sense. But what happened was over time, the French became convinced that the rebels could actually win the war, and so they got help. And so in the famous Battle of Yorktown in 1781, the Americans actually bottled up a British army, the main British army led by Lord Cornwallis, who will later on go to India and have an illustrious career there. And this time, the British aren't able just to swoop in and rescue their army. The French Navy's there. It wins in battle against the British, and is able to stop that. And so what happens is the British actually are forced to surrender. and this is the last major battle in the war. It'll drag on for a couple more years, but it's going to end with the American victory. And on one side, it seems a little odd for the French to do this, right? The French are aiding a colony drawing upon Enlightenment ideas to rebel against a monarch, when France itself is an absolutist monarchy that claims a lot more power than the British king. But the French logic is essentially, hey, a few years ago we fought the French Indian War and the British defeated us. This is a way we can kind of pay them back and weaken them and maybe get some power, some of our power back in the end. And it turns out to be kind of a miscalculation. But that was their kind of logic, was that, hey, we can, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But what's key, I think, in a large part about the American Revolution in terms of global history is it shows that it can be done, right? You can, as a colony, break away successfully from the mother country. Now, winning the revolution is one thing, getting rid of a government is one thing, starting a new one is something else, and it's certainly not easy. But you have this difficult transformation, right? You have to transfer colonials, these people, these 13 different colonies with very different kinds of economies and very different kinds of populations. You have to transfer them into Americans, and you have to answer all these questions. What sort of government should we have? How far should democracy go? And this can very easily lead to violence, and we see this in Shays' Rebellion of 1786. And this was essentially a rebellion of farmers, many of whom were veterans, looking for tax and debt relief. It was really almost a kind of class warfare, right? The Shayites, as they're called, were again these poor farmers looking for tax and debt relief, and they fight if I recall correctly, they don't fight so much, and they're not opposed so much by the National Army of the United States, but by a militia paid for by Boston merchants, basically the people who are owed money by the Shayites, right? So you have Shays' Rebellion is almost kind of a case of class warfare, and you can see kind of the frustration because these people, again, that are rebelling were veterans. And the thing that was it's shocking if you study Shays' Rebellion, it wasn't really much of a rebellion. There wasn't really much fighting. There was only one really short battle. Basically, the American, or the forces representing the government, fired on the Shayites, and the Shayites scrambled away shouting murder. And the reason they did that, they didn't think that their fellow veterans, their fellow Americans would fire on them, but they did, in order to kind of put a stop to this effort of popular revolt. Right, so there were fears that democracy, in a sense, was going too far, that there were going to be excesses, that you didn't want to encourage these people, in a sense, these poor people, to think that the republic was necessarily looking out for them first, right? You needed to establish some kind of order. I may be being too harsh on the forces of the wealthier people here. There was a fear that the ideas of freedom could go too far and endanger the republic, which would then destroy it and destroy freedom for everyone, right? That they would have to switch to a monarchy or to something else, because if they couldn't curb the excesses of democracy, they were going to have to turn to a strong hand to rule them. And that's what's going to happen in the French Revolution, essentially, as we'll see. So there's kind of a conservative reaction saying, okay, we need some freedom, but not too much. And this freedom has to be concentrated within the better classes of society, within the wealthier classes of society, within the educated classes of society. And these fears then lead to a constitution, 1787, that says, okay, we are going to have a more centralized government, right? We need to have a centralized government in order to respond to popular movements such as this, in order to crush them if need be. Right, we don't want to have to rely on the people of Boston to field a militia when we run into trouble, right? We need a national government with an army. Now, there's later on in order to get the Constitution passed, though, you also have to have a Bill of Rights later appended to it that also limits government power. And this will be important because some people really thought that there needed to be a very strong line taken to stop these kind of activities. And the Bill of Rights prevented them from undertaking some more draconian laws. The one thing, though, is that in this Constitution and in the Bill of Rights, there's except for the 3/5 compromise, there's almost, I don't want to go in there, but essentially there's an effort in these bills and in these constitutions to avoid conflict over slavery, so the issue is barely mentioned, right? they're not going to talk about slavery. That's just too dangerous. It's too difficult. We're just not going to deal with this very difficult issue right now because we're afraid it will tear our young country apart. And of course it will about 80, 90 years later. And, and instead what they're basically hoping for is that the land to the west will act as a safety valve, which will help people, will help give a place for poor farmers like Shea and so forth to go, rather than to end up in debt, so they can get their property. And that will keep down class conflict, and will help the new republic continue. So what's important is to remember in our history is the land to the west is seen as an important safety valve for disaffected people. It's a place where they can go and start anew and develop their own property and so forth. And so this is a big drive, for the young country. Now, this brings us then to the French Revolution, which of course you can see it happens after the American Revolution, about 6 years after the American Revolution is concluded. So these things are all connected. You have this, remember in France you have the idea of royal absolutism. The king is only responsible to God and not to the people. And you have this but at the same you have at the same time the rise of Enlightenment ideas as well that kind of try and challenge this, right? And so you have a kind of questioning of this royal absolutism that's going on throughout 17th and 18th century France, and it's slowly eating away at the idea, challenging it with ideas of popular sovereignty. And what exacerbates this is the economic situation. And I should also point out, and then you have the Americans who successfully revolt, and challenge and overthrow a king, at least within their own colony. I mean, that's a little different from what's going to happen with the French Revolution. But the key thing is the American Revolution shows that you can have a revolt and win, right? And it's important to note that there were important, and then of course the Americans were ally of France. The French people were familiar with them. Benjamin Franklin particularly was a darling of the French party scene and the French media. The American Revolution also affected things another way. In order to help the Americans, the French government borrowed a lot of money, and to pay that money back, it increased taxes. So the American Revolution, and they pushed down very hard on the peasants, and France really had a what we call a regressive tax structure. Usually, for example, in the income tax, right, in the United States today, the more money you make, the more percentage of your income you have to pay. But here, it was the peasants, the poorest people, who had to pay the most, whereas high-ranking clergy and high-ranking nobles had to pay little or no taxes, right? So these taxes came down very hard on the peasants and on the lower groups in society, and so you had economic changes. And this is going to radicalize these people in a large extent. They're going to really despise the government in a way that the Americans didn't have. I mean, the Americans certainly didn't like King George III, but I doubt that they would have killed him, as Louis XVI would, of course, later on be killed. So you have this problem of trying to raise taxes and to pay for all these old debts, and the king is having trouble doing that. So he calls the French version of the English Parliament called the Estates General. Now, because of the idea of royal absolutism and the power that kings like Louis XIV wielded, you didn't need the French didn't call their parliament, right? And this is why they're different from the British, right? The British actually have a parliament. It develops power, and specifically the power to tax. The Estates General wasn't allowed by the French to do that, by the French monarchy to do that. So they finally called it in 1788. It's been about 100 years or so since it's been called. And it turns out to be a very radical group of people, especially in the Third Estate, which is the one that represents the kind of common people. And they end up calling for a revolution. They say that we need to transform things. We need to get rid of royal absolutism and so forth. We need to start governing more along the lines of popular sovereignty, keeping in mind the needs of the peasants and the poor. And you can see this idea of popular sovereignty because the Third Estate, the poor people, the first two estates, the first estate is nobility, the second estate are the clergy. The Third Estate declares itself the National Assembly, right? They say, we, the people, this being popular sovereignty, are the ones that get to rule. And they quickly abolished the ancient privileges of the nobles and the clergy. They argue for or they argue that they proclaim that the new virtues of the country will be liberty, equality, and fraternity. And this leads to unrest throughout the country. There begins to be peasant risings in the provinces. You have, of course, the famous storming of the Bastille on July 14th, 1789, and the government issues the so-called Declaration of the Rights of Man, which are similar to the American Bill of Rights, but more radical in many ways. However, again, they have the same issue. And your source book, by the way, has talks about the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Um, and it also includes Declaration of the Rights of Women as well. The Declaration of Rights of Man became law. It was promulgated by the National Assembly. The Declaration of the Rights of Women, though, is just one woman's attempt to kind of extend this logic and say, well, men have these rights to liberty, equality, and fraternity and so forth. Why don't we women? Why are you holding them back from us? And again, you have this problem, how far does freedom extend? And in this case, it was decided that it certainly didn't extend to women, and so they don't get these rights. And in fact, the woman who writes that pamphlet will eventually be guillotined. Um, Now, there is, over time, though, this becomes very, very radical, the revolution. There's increasing attacks on nobility and clergy, and a lot of these people will flee. Um, a lot of them are killed. There is and there's a lot of kind of different rules taken against them, um, or different kind of laws passed against them, making their lives very difficult and that of their family. For example, if you're nobility and you flee France because you don't want to get your head cut off, your family can be punished. Um, and there's also, and just as there were risings against the monarchy, there's actually risings for the monarchy and for the Catholic Church, especially in one region in France. There's a very strong loyalty to the king, very strong loyalty to the church, and the revolutionaries put down this rebellion and kill at least 100,000 people. So this is very, very bloody work, and this includes many women and children. They took out some of the prisoners, including women and children, for example, and put them out on boats in the middle of the lake, and then sunk the boats. And of course, those people died, right? So this is very bloody. You don't have this kind of mass bloodletting to the same. You do have some kind of nasty wars in during the American Revolution, some very nasty battles, and you do have some massacre, but nothing like this, right? And there's also foreign wars, right? France soon finds itself at war with most of the other European powers, um, in part because they want to spread the ideas of the revolution, right? And as I pointed to before, you have the French use of conscription, drafting men to have them fight in the army. And this allows France to do very well in these wars, right? It's at about 800,000, an army of 800,000 people. I mean, that's gigantic. And sometimes it's referred to as the nation at arms, right? The whole country is in arms. So things are very difficult. And this leads then in part to the terror of 1793 to 1794 and this man named Robespierre. And we will have a discussion on some of his writings on Friday. But what you want to note is how he kind of uses the specter of foreign wars and foreign agents in order to justify taking very, very strong measures in order to save the revolution. And under him, about 40,000 people are executed. There's this desire to basically eliminate all vestiges of the noble and clerical power by the guillotine, right? So the key thing, you just don't have this in the American Revolution. And I think this is one reason why there's this conservative reaction against Shays' Rebellion. There's this fear over what things can happen. And of course, those people who took those actions against Shays' Rebellion and who centralized the American government and focused the Republic more on the middle and upper classes rather than the lower classes, they would look at the French Revolution and say, see, we were right to do that, right? Look what happens. And one thing I should point out too, that your book doesn't quite go into detail about it. For example, you had this oath that the clergy are forced to take, and this is an oath saying that they should basically reject the Pope. They shouldn't allow him to have power over the Catholic Church in France, and it says that priests and bishops should be elected. And what was interesting about this was you didn't have to be Catholic to elect the bishops and priests. You could actually be Protestant or Jewish and decide who the Catholic clergy were going to be. So of course the Catholics resisted this, and because of this resistance, this is one reason why when they killed these 40,000 people, they included several thousand priests and nuns as well. So, and a lot of this is the logic of nationalism, right? We don't want that foreign pope ruling over our church. We want our church to be a truly national church. And so this is just, the French Revolution is just a very bloody, very difficult time. Now eventually so-called, your book refers to them the moderates. I don't know if I would call them moderates, but certainly people more moderate than Robespierre will eventually seize control of the government and will guillotine him. Now, the government of these moderates, as often governments by moderates are, wasn't particularly strong. It was having difficulty dealing with the problems, the forces unleashed by the French Revolution, and they started to lose the wars. And so in 1799, there was a coup by military officers, and Napoleon will eventually become the dominant force among these soldiers. And in 1804, Napoleon will declare himself Emperor of the French. And this is really striking. He'll continue a lot of the revolutionary changes, particularly those that contribute to state power, as conscription. He'll change some. A lot of the revolutionaries really wanted to destroy Catholicism. They tried to replace Catholicism with a religion of reason and so forth. They had temples to reason and things like that. And this, as I pointed out, also they tried to make the priests swear all these oaths and so forth, and they killed a lot of priests and monks. Napoleon stopped that and gave religious toleration to the Catholics. So he continues some revolutionary changes, like I said, especially those that contribute to state power. He doesn't include others. But the key thing is Napoleon ends up being a very popular ruler. And it's really striking how you have this shift from this very radical idea of democracy, liberty, equality, and fraternity, and all this. And because of its excesses, in a sense, you have the rise of this dictator. Right, and this is exactly, in a sense, what the Americans were trying to avoid early on. Now, Napoleon's empire lasts from 1799 essentially to 1815. Just like Suleiman, he becomes a lawgiver, right? He uses law in order to try and bind his new empire together. So he issues a new law code. And he sees himself as like the Romans. He's building a new Roman empire, one centered in France. However, he does find that there's a lot of resistance from the areas he's conquered. And he wants to spread some of the ideas of the revolution, and that's one reason he encounters resistance, and people don't want the French necessarily to rule them. So, for example, Napoleon conquers Spain, but the Spanish people are very resistant to French rule, and rise up in guerrilla armies. And I'm sure you know that word, Guerrilla, guerrilla, refers to these kind of bands of people not in uniform fighting against the government. And that's where it comes from. It's from the Spanish word. Has a Spanish derivation. And the key thing, though, is that so while Napoleon is going through bringing reforms and conquering other European countries and then reforming them, this often, while some of the reforms take, for example, in Germany, he abolishes serfdom, which is, of course, very popular among serfs. They also lead to greater nationalism, right? There's this feeling that we Spanish people are one people, all equally oppressed by the French, so let's get rid of them, right? So this leads to changes in Europe. It leads to especially greater nationalism. Now, Napoleon attempts to invade Russia in 1812. The Russian army basically just retreats and won't fight him, and of course then the Russian winter sets in, and Napoleon's troops are starving, and they have to flee. And they lose this battle, and this weakens them, and they're defeated eventually. And Napoleon is captured and sent into exile. He comes back, though, in 1815, raises an army. He's hailed by the French as wonderful, as great, and they fight the Battle of Waterloo, and he's defeated. And that's the end of Napoleon, essentially. And the nations of Europe meet in the Congress of Vienna. They make sure that there's going to be a throne. They put a French monarch back on the throne, another Bourbon, and they want to do their best to hold back revolution. So they try and redraft, they make various laws and various rules about how people should act, try and establish a balance of power in Europe, so there'll be a hope that there'll be no more major wars, no more major bloodlettings like this. And basically, it's kind of a conservative reaction to the French Empire. We don't want all these excesses of freedom, right? We want to keep things orderly and stable. Now, during this time, of course, you have the Haiti, which is a colony of France, a French colony, has a very high population of slaves. In fact, more than 10-to-1 ratio of slaves over whites, and of over free whites, and about 7 to 8 to 1 over free blacks. So there's a lot of slaves here. And during the French Revolutions leads whites to call for self-government and the slaves to call for freedom. And of course, this eventually leads to a civil war and French attempts to reconquer the colony. These all fail. And in 1804, Haiti is declared a republic. And it's the second republic of the Americas, right? The United States is the first, which we can date to say 1776, and Haiti is the second in 1804, right? Now the problem though is that because it is a republic led by people of African descent primarily, it has trouble finding recognition. The United States certainly isn't going to recognize it, right? Because it may give African slaves in the United States too many ideas, right? And when I mean recognize, I mean give it diplomatic recognition, recognize it as a legitimate state. And the Americans aren't interested in doing that. Very few other people are interested in doing it either. But this is a case you see where the already the effects of the French Revolution are being felt on a more global scale. Now, it's not going to be so much the French world, in a sense, in the Americas, in part because the French aren't very powerful in the Americas since they were driven out by the English 30 or 40 years before the French Revolution. It's going to be in the Iberian world, the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, where you're going to feel this more, the effects of the French Revolution, in several different ways. The French Revolution, of course, encouraged the ideas of revolution and enlightenment to spread, right? There was this idea, we're not just talking anymore, we're going to follow through on these ideas. And the French did, in a large degree, succeed, right? They did overthrow their king, and they set up a new kind of, they did not only overthrow their king, they executed their king, right? Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are guillotined. And so this was further evidence that this could be done. Right? But also, of course, Spain itself is conquered by France, and so is Portugal. And of course, this weakened their power over the colonies, right? It's easier if you want to rebel against a country that's weak. And this, of course, seriously weakened Spain. I mean, Spain, the conqueror of the Aztecs and all of Latin America, essentially has been defeated and conquered itself. And also, even though colonies maybe stayed loyal during the revolutionary period itself, they had the experience of running the show themselves, right? While the Spanish are busy being conquered, even colonies that stay loyal to Spain have to take care of matters themselves. And this gives them experience of self-government, and that's hard to give up on, right? But what we should stress, though, of course, is some of the early rebellions within the Iberian world actually strengthen elite ties, elite loyalty to the mother country, because they're afraid of radical reform, right? The elites, because in a large part, they're interested in maintaining their own freedom, particularly their economic freedom, and so they're willing to stay aligned with their mother countries as long as they protect their economic interest, right? They're afraid of the rebellions of the common people, and they'll turn to the power of their mother countries to protect them from that. And so when the elites do rebel in Latin America, they're usually much more conservative than France, and even more conservative than America in the kind of nation that they want to build and the extension of freedom, both economic and political, they want to give, right? So economic interests severely limit the depth of political and economic freedom that will be allowed, even by those who rebel in the Iberian world. Now, the first example we will use is that of Brazil, which of course is a Portuguese colony. Napoleon conquered Brazil, and the royal family, though, saw it coming, and they fled to Brazil. And they stayed there, and they stayed on, actually, remember Napoleon's defeat in 1851, but it's not until 1821 that the king returns to Portugal. And there ends up being in Brazil, and he leaves his son Pedro in charge while he's gone. Now, the elites in Brazil, and also people, more common people, more the lower orders, are not particularly happy with the Portuguese rule. They kind of want to see things, they want to bring things under power themselves. They don't see the point of being ruled by this king far, far away. especially when he had been right there ruling them. Um, so what ends up happening is, of all things, the son, Pedro, declares Brazil's independence from Portugal. And the reason he wanted to do that was he wanted to get the elites, he wanted to satisfy the elites and get them on his side so together they could unite and stop popular revolt. Because there was a fear, okay, if we let this revolution go on, if we let this unrest go on, we're all going to be overthrown, right? And the common people, the elites, will take power, and you'll have something more like the French Revolution in its later stages. We don't want that. We want something more like the American Revolution, right? So he declares independence, and this allows him to unite with the elites to put down several urban and rural uprisings. And what this eventually does is it allows Brazil to form a government, an independent government from a government independent from Portugal, with a large amount of stability, without significant unrest after these initial risings. So you have a stable country, in part because I think they're kind of learning from the experience of the Americans and the French, and saying we don't want to go down this road of bloody, far-reaching revolution. We both basically just want elite control and elite political freedom and economic freedom, not so much for the other people. Mexico, a Spanish colony, has a very different kind of experience. Essentially, like the Brazil enjoyed autonomy. Well, the Spain, I'm sorry, not like Brazil, Portugal and Brazil. Brazil, of course, has the Portuguese king ruling over them during the Napoleonic Wars. In Mexico, it was a little different. They essentially enjoyed autonomy during the Napoleonic Wars, and the Creoles became resentful of attempts by the Peninsulars. You remember, Creoles are people born, they're pure-blood Spaniards born in the colonies, are resentful of attempts by Peninsulars, pure-blood Spaniards born in Spain, to reassert their authority. Right? We've been running the show for a long time. We don't want to deal with that anymore. Right? And they critiqued Spanish rule using Enlightenment ideas. But the elites weren't the only ones doing this. There were also people who were on the lower classes of society who disagreed. And in 1810 to 1813, a couple of priests actually led a major rebellion that included some elites, but especially people, again, from the lower orders of society. And this rebellion is only put down with great difficulty, and there's still a lot of chaos afterwards. So what ends up happening is the military officials who had previously been loyal to Spain realize that Spain is not going to be able to help them keep order. They think they need to keep power in their own hands in order to keep order in society. And so in 1821, they declare independence. And the key thing in Mexico then, it's a different kind of experience, right? They're declaring independence not in order to further, in a sense, democracy or freedom so much as to get stability. And of course, also they're going to include these ideas that the elites should have freedom. But they're trying to get stability and power to use against the lower orders who are rebelling and calling for more of a French Revolution style kind of government, right? So this is all very, very... so the key thing here is we can see how the experience of the French Revolution and the American Revolutions are felt differently in different countries depending on their historical context. And here is an image of one of these priests leading this rebellion, and you can see it does include people from all different kinds of social strata, right? We see what looks to be some gentlemen here, some Indians, some people of African descent. We see lots of different kind of people, but there was a feeling that this was a group that was going to demand very far-reaching changes, right? And this would be opposed by the elites. And I just also want to point out, you notice someone is holding back the banner there of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which we talked about previously, and this is kind of a symbol that can hold Mexicans together. Now, other parts of Latin America, we won't go too deeply into them, but just to make a couple points, are also trying to rebel, and you have wars of independence of these other Spanish colonies between 1810 to 1824, and all of them are essentially going to become independent. But what ends up happening, there's a goal, right, for them to have independence. And you have people like this guy, Simon Bolivar, who are searching, who are trying to establish Enlightenment ideas and union between these colonies. They want these colonies to be drawn together into a larger, more powerful colonies, especially the 5 countries that make up Central America. and he manages to help them rebel and establish central states, but he fails to get them to establish a union. And in part, this is because the elites don't see themselves. They rather, in a sense, be governing their own country rather than to be a part of a larger country. So whereas the United States is able to kind of rally around this fear of the British first to form a kind of use the Articles of Confederation and form a kind of loose confederation of the colonies, and then is able to, because of the fear of rebellions like Shays' Rebellion, have a constitution that binds them more closely together. This doesn't happen in Latin America, right? So what will happen is you have a lot of smaller countries being established without having a union. And it would be curious. I wonder how history maybe would have been different if you would have had a United States of Latin America, right? It would have been a much, of course, larger, more powerful country that could have competed much more against American dominance in the region. So you have in Latin America then, you have independence, you have the establishment of states, but states where it's typically the political and economic elites who govern for their own economic interest, oftentimes allied with military strongmen, but not a powerful union. Well, that concludes our lecture for our makeup lecture. Remember that you'll have, we'll be meeting on Wednesday. I will March 7th, and I will lecture on that day, and I will hand out the review sheet on that day as well. On March 9th, on that Friday, your primary source assignment number 1 is due, and we'll have student presentations on that day. And after we do the student presentations, we will run our review session. So please bring your questions. Remember, March 12th, March 12th, Monday, we will not be having class. March 14th, Wednesday, we will be having the midterm. Right. So if you have any questions, then just feel free to email me or to come talk to me during office hours. I look forward to seeing you all again on Wednesday, March 7th.